Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Moss, and today we're here with a little bit of a different video. We are taking a analytic look at where the Pioneer metagame is halfway through this current competitive season. Welcome to Primetime News? Something like that? We're just gonna run with it, see how it goes, but consider this and all future iterations of this your home for competitive Magic news. So, if you're here, chances are you're already trying to do the whole grindy thing. All right, let me go out there and go to as many of these RCQs and events as I can. Well, here's the thing. This RCQ season, it's been going on for about a good month and a half almost now. The RCs of this season, which for those of you that don't remember, these are all Pioneer events. The final two RCs happen this coming weekend. We've got Brazil and South America having theirs the 1st and the 2nd of July. Now, some of you might be panicking. Maybe I didn't do so well at my, RC that I qualified for. Maybe these RCQs have been hard, to use a phrase that I've seen thrown around. They're not Charmin soft. Well, good news for you. This season has a little bit longer to go. Right now, it's the end of June. You've got a little over a month and a half. About 6 more weeks of competitive play to try and get your qualification for this season. And after that, we're going to have a small break. A nice 2-3 week window with the new RCQ season beginning September 9th. This season and all of the RCs that it will feed into will be Pioneer. The next season, however, is Modern. So if you've already gotten your qualification and you're looking ahead, pay attention to what's about to happen at the Barcelona event coming up here in the next week or so, because that's where we're going to see Modern coming out in a big way. I have a feeling if you haven't already gotten your copy of the One Ring, start investing in it. It's seeing a lot of play across every single modern deck that can play it. And if you're not in that camp, go ahead and get all your Cascaders, because Living In and Rhinos are definitely going to be major forces at the beginning of this coming modern format. But that's not why you're here. You don't want to know about the future. You want to know about what's happening now in the Pioneer format. And we're going to start with one that's kind of close to home for me. I'm in the American South, a little bit far away from Dallas, but let's start off looking at where RC Dallas showed us what the Pioneer metagame is going to look like. Now, here, it was actually fairly balanced. Sure, there might have been 2 copies of Rakdos Sacrifice that made it to the top 8 of RC Dallas, but it was a very wide spread with, surprisingly, no Rakdos midrange, despite being one of the most well-represented decks in the format right now. Now, that being said, a lot of these decks do prey on the weaknesses of Rakdos midrange. Mono Green Devotion, the obvious antithesis to Rakdos midrange. Mono Blue Spirits, Azorius Spirits having lots of counter spells and counterplay for that deck. Sacrifice being able to get under it, do combo things while still having a kind of mid-rangey game plan. Gruul Vehicles being able to go under it and take its big threats. Enigmatic Fires going over the top of it. And Dimir Rogues, again, being able to sneak under and throw counter spells to get through any of the Rakdos decks. Now, again, this is a very balanced showing of the Pioneer format. Honestly, this might be one of the better representations of it that we get. Where people may complain that Pioneer is draw go dependent, it's a coin toss, It's you win against this deck or you lose to it type of format. Here, we see that it's a lot more open, a lot more balanced. There's a lot of skill determining how your games will go. But again, all of these preyed on Rakdos, which was very well represented. So there is something to be said there. But one of the things that you're going to see is that I'm going to point out some of the standout decks. Enigmatic Fires here was one of the standouts. It was realistically one of the few copies that we've actually seen across all of the RCs in a top 8. Most of the time, it's not Enigmatic Fires. It's not Omnath to light as the multicolored deck of choice. This is the anomaly. Now, if you haven't seen the deck in play, definitely worth looking at some of the matches that we witnessed this enigmatic player go through. But your deck is built around sticking Enigmatic Incarnation and basically potting your enchantments into other greater things. One of the reasons why this particular version did so well in Dallas, again, positioned against a room full of Rakdos and a lot of things to hate on Rakdos. You have cards like Coma that stop your opponent from actually being able to cast and utilize their creatures, their spells, their value engines. Shieldred to punish any card advantage. Tolsimir to kill creatures and gain some life off of it. Alish Norn to basically shut down anything. And then Atraxa, obviously, being this massive value piece herself. Another thing that really helped this deck out is the removal suite. Touch the Spirit Realm, sure, it exiles a creature or a artifact. Great. Sure, Leyline Binding gets rid of any non-land permanent. Cool. One of the biggest things to pay attention to with this deck is the fact that it runs Temporary Lockdown. Temporary Lockdown gets rid of anything with mana value 2 or less. That's everything here and here. Most of the stuff here, here, and here. Praise on so much. And the fact that Boros Convoke was a really big question mark going into this, running copies of Temporary Lockdown to just slow that deck to a crawl is huge. Combine that with more copies in the sideboard, Karuga for massive card advantage and everything else. Unsurprising why this deck ended up doing really well here in Dallas in particular. But people learned from this. They learned that hating out Rakdos wasn't enough. And that having to deal with mono green and speeding through it was also going to be integral. So we go to some of these other RCs where they are looking at trying to get under mono green. Again, focusing on one deck, letting the shortcomings of the others not really be as big a problem. And this is what we saw at the Mexican RC. All right. A interesting top 8 when we compare it to Dallas, because where there were 0 Rakdos mid-range decks there were 3 here. Rakdos mid-range had its best showing at the Mexico City RC. Rona Combo has only 1 successful RC top 8, and it's here. And then we saw a little bit of spice in Orzhov Humans. Again, these are decks that can outrun mono green. Way faster, can do their game plan, and Rakdos can disrupt it. Again, it's the natural enemy here, but all of these other decks are just overcoming mono green. So the Rakdos players in the room, it's still been the most represented deck at every single RC. That's not to say that it's not there, but these Rakdos players thrived in a room where mono green was definitely being oppressed. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of these deck lists. The Rakdos decks that did well in Mexico, they're honestly kind of basic. 2 Misery Shadow, 2 Trespasser, 3 Shieldred. The spiciest thing that they were doing at this time was maybe running a Liliana in the main board. And then there is the Power Word Kill Heartless Act combo here. It's important to understand that the weekend that all of this happened, we had not seen much of the Alteration Archfiend deck that's become so popular, be it the Grixis version that actually did show up in Dallas and do fairly well because no one knew what to do, or the blue-black versions that have emerged since then. Power Word Kill flounders in the face of that deck. Oh, I have this demon that you can't kill. Okay, I just win. I've always been higher on Go for the Throat, and yeah, you get to miss out on taking out the vehicles out of opposing Rakdos decks, or Gruul vehicles, or out of Greasefang. But having an answer there that's a lot cleaner, especially when Heartless Act can't do the job either, huge. But again, not necessarily a massive problem here. And being able to eat up basically every single Convoke deck that was showing up, Hidetsugu Consumes All became a very popular sideboard piece as people started really looking at that deck seriously. It's a huge plus on a Rakdos player's favor. Now, one of the other things that we've seen innovated with Rakdos in the weeks since has been an increase to 26 lands, a move away from the Shoto Yashuka Mutavault versions, and moving to Invoke Despair in the main. That was a really common sight at the Japanese RC, where we did see a couple of Rakdos decks doing well. That's looking like the potential future of this deck. But this is the current standard, the accepted way of doing Rakdos, and it's not surprising why a couple of different versions like this did well in Mexico City. In addition to that, we do have to pay attention to the one Rona list. It's a combo deck. It's a deck where you want to deck yourself with Rona drawing all of these cards and then potentially winning there. You've got the ability to wish for powerful I win pieces like Aetherflux Reservoir. You've got the ability to just really run down your opponent. There's so much that this deck can do, and the fact that it gets to run a very seldom used companion for Pioneer in Zerta, it's a win in my book, but it's surprising that it made it super far in Mexico City, simply because all of these creatures died a fatal push, all of them died to rending volley. When people weren't targeting the typical things that Rakdos would go after, it's understandable why this gets to show up and just show out at something of that level. And then finally, Orzhov Humans. Now, with March of the Machines Aftermath, we got Coppercoat Vanguard, which has definitely been a huge plus for the Humans decks, but it hasn't been the plus that everyone thought that it would be. It's definitely made the Humans deck more resilient, but as we're going to see as we go through this, while Humans decks continue to perform well, they're not dominating like some initially thought they would. This doesn't protect itself. You need multiple instances of Coppercoat Vanguard in order for it to get nutty. Remove one copy, though, which isn't hard, with Rending Volley being a very popular sideboard card in the format, and you no longer have to worry about that ward cost. Can't be countered. This card's good, but there's still a lot of very common hate pieces for it. However, this version running General Kudro to exile to kind of deal with some of the Grease Fang decks, to deal with some of the graveyard synergies that existed in the format. And it gets to pump your team. Pretty sweet. Dire Tactics being a good removal spell. Again, phenomenal. Sure, sacrifice something, but not that bad. Lots of good black-based hate in the sideboard. Jarina seems a little redundant with General Kudro just because of that exile effect, but having more of it to deal with the Grease Fang decks makes a lot of sense. If you were still expecting Rona combo, makes a little bit of sense. Raven Feeblement, Thoughtseize, Containment Priest, Meat Hook Massacre, it's everything that you could expect. Great pieces here to deal with some of the decks that were kind of popular at the Dallas RC, in particular, dealing with Sacrifice. Pretty huge, but overall, nothing too crazy. All right, moving on to the MIT, or the Southeast Asia RC. Again, we see a good bit of that balance coming back. Yeah, more Rakdos did succeed here. Yeah, more mono green showed up here, but still varied. We got control, we got fires, we got humans, and the standout here, something that doesn't show up anywhere else, 4-color elementals. Now, streamers like Doomwake have played this deck since then, and it's a pretty fire deck. Okay, you've got Elish Norn to double triggers, you've got Nissa to help search for stuff, you've got 4-color Omnath, you've got Dorito Finger Omnath, Risen Reef, all value. And then things to just kind of support those synergies. It's honestly a very simple enough deck to get. It's just creature-based value. The only thing that this deck realistically does different than the Omnath to Light piles is that it's not running some of the bad one-ofs to tutor for with your Bring to Light targets. And I feel like Nissa doing a different version of that and just removing creatures, removing threats with all of these things and being able to just churn through your deck at such a massive and just blistering rate, it's important for this deck. Combine that with just good things out of the side, and yeah, this is a Bring to Lightless Omnath deck. Maybe not the best direction because a lot of those one-ups are pretty good targets, but overall, it's the result. Can't argue with results. All right, moving on to the Chinese RC. Again, a lot more of that balance. There is one trend that we start to see as we make our way through the Indian and Pacific Oceans, and we start to look at more Eastern RCs. We start to see a lot more counter spells. And this is important if you are looking to do well in some of your events for the remainder of the season. Counter spell decks do very well when you combine being low to the ground and aggressive with that counterspell backup. There's a reason why the Azorius Spirits decks have done really well continually throughout this season. And it's a combination of good counterspells and good aggression. There's a reason why Rogues has shown up a couple of times, although in mine and a number of others' opinions, Dimir Rogues is kind of a worse Spirits deck. Sure, you get Thoughtseize. Sure, you get Drown in the Lock. But in order to do that, you have to feed into a lot of graveyard synergies, and it's not the greatest feeling. But with the Chinese RC, what we see here is a lot more of a concentrated meta. Counterspell deck, Rakdos, mono green. 2 Azorius control decks. 2 Lotus Field decks, and a Tarka Red. The name of the game to winning in this Pioneer meta is aggression. Either having the means to stop it and effectively come back from it, or harnessing it as best you can. That tempo style of play with strong aggression and protection counters is huge. Atarka Red, though, hyper aggressive. This is basically what all of the Convoke decks owe their existence to. Because being able to Reckless Bushwhacker and just go big spell, big spell, big spell, Atarka's command to pump and deal 3 damage. This is the design by which Convoke tries to thrive. It's super straightforward, big turns with Burning Tree Emissary and a Bushwhacker. You can Blood Rush your Gore Clan Rampager onto any of your creatures to boost up the damage. It's super straightforward. You win by turn 3 or 4. And if you can't, then any of these decks that can successfully turn the corner will. Now, Lotus Field is a little bit of a standout here because to this point, Lotus Field had slowly been reclaiming its place in the metagame, mostly due to Rakdos finally having the tools to, either deal with it or Rakdos just falling off, as we've seen here. Here, Lotus Field is doing well in a meta where Rakdos is falling off. It can come back. It can just focus on doing its combo while other combo decks try to do their thing. It's efficient. Realistically, as good of a deck as Lotus Field is, it is not the deck that you want to take to an RC, especially if you don't have the reps with it. This is a good deck in the hands of someone who has practiced and knows the lines like the back of their hand, but this is not the deck to take to your RC. It's not aggressive enough. But if you've got the reps and you know that mid-range decks will be present, this might be a good choice. All right, moving on to Edmonton, going back to the Americas, looking at what Canada did here and at Toronto. We see what happens when mid-range decks do make a very strong presence. Mono green preys on the room. Fast combo decks prey on the room. Now, Phoenix, Spirits, and Sacrifice did manage to make their way in. Understand, however, these are decks that do have pretty decent lines now against Rakdos mid-range. But if there's a lot of mid-range in a room, Mono Green is set to just tear that room apart. Neoform is a deck that is hard for many people to interact with, and it is one of those graveyard-based decks. If you don't do anything to stop them by turn 3 when they can go off, then the game's over. Alright, Mono Green, it's been a major player in the format for ages. Realistically, I'm not the person to talk about how Mono Green wins, how important these sideboard slots are. I'm the Rakdos player that normally looks at this deck and sinks into their chair knowing that they're probably taking an L in that matchup. But Cityscape Leveler, Damping Sphere, Asika's Chariot, Karn shutting down your tokens, shutting down all the artifacts, being able to search for any of these, and the fact that you've got the Pestilent Cauldron combo just waiting, you can tear through any aggressive deck just by gaining the life from here or with Haywire Might. There is a lot that this deck can do. And again, not surprising why 3 copies made their way into the top 8 at Edmonton. And again, Atraxa, this is really the only instance of it that we see having success in the RCs. But fill your graveyard with otherworldly gaze, consider strategic planning, land a Hooting Mandrills or Tassiger and Neoform it into Dragonlord Atarka, or into Atraxa, refill your hand, or out of the sideboard, do it with Hornet Queen, save a Hullbreaker Horror. Like, this deck is just an insane combo. You have to know how to stop it. You have to be prepared if you're expecting it in a room. But if you're expecting it in a room, you're also hoping to just kind of skirt it because you know you are set up for a lot of other good things. Deck's a good combo deck, but it can very easily be hated out. Definitely an iffy consideration. Toronto, again, we saw a lot more of the same. If there's a room where Rakdos is doing well, Mono Green's going to do well. If people are hating on this and this, Rakdos Sacrifice can be a good counter. Rakdos Sacrifice and Mono Green Devotion have a lot of back and forth. It's a fairly even matchup, almost. If they stick a Karn, this deck loses, but if they don't, this deck gets out of hand. The standouts here, however, again, those tempo-y counterspell decks, and just counterspell decks in general. One of the biggest decks to emerge in this particular RC season has been Azorius Lotus Field. Now, it's a deck that if you've been playing Arena, you might be wondering, well, why are we even talking about this? This is a deck that has been common on Arena in the Explorer ladder, but it has not made a big splash in the paper meta until now. Now, Patrick Wu did phenomenally with this deck at the Toronto RC. The deck functions real simply. Strict Proctor on 2, Lotus Field on 3. Make 5 mana that you can do whatever with. And then you just start going crazy with the big spells. Finale of Revelation. You've got Discontinuity to stop your opponent on their turn from even doing anything. Dream Trawler and Shark Typhoon to finish the game. Deck is a nasty counterspell deck. And Strict Proctor is a must answer threat, or else the value that your opponent will get is insane. You have to kill this before they play this. This is the best combination of Lotus Field combo and control. There might not be the big finish, but know that if this hits the field, you are finished. And Azorius Spirits, again, it's what you would expect. You've seen it before, you're going to see it a lot. If you're playing at an RCQ, if you're a red-based deck, you need to have at least 3 Rending Volleys in your sideboard to deal with this set of shenanigans. And if you're playing this deck, make sure you don't leave home without packing 4 of your Spell Quellers and at least 4 Geistlight Snares. Run as many counter spells as you can because you will have a real fun time in a room playing with any of these. All right, at Athens, again, we go back to that idea of balance. There's a mid-range deck, sacrifice decks, control deck, tempo deck, value, mono green, and one of the first instances of it making it into the top 8 at the LEC, the Legacy Championship in Athens, was Boros Convoke. The Hogak of the format, it showed up. And it did its thing very well. You've seen the video on the channel before, but here it is, presented to you in its current glory. There's been a little bit of innovation in teching that has gone on with this deck, and seeing Clarion Spirit and Regal Leosaur as threats in the main, pretty significant. Being able to mutate this onto anything and then have an extra Bushwhacker effect, but honestly, kind of better since it's bigger. Huge. And then you've got things like Forge Devil, new innovation in the side, and Surge of Salvation to deal with all the hate that was coming to this deck from red and black based decks. It's only reasonable. All right. And in Chinese Taipei, at their RC, we see Lotus Field doing well again. Again, more of this balance across the format. We see Azorius Control in its traditional form and Lotus Field Control standing out. We got another Convoke deck, Humans, Mono Green. Two Rakdos mid-range copies, again, aggressive strategies to just beat them down. And surprisingly, the only instance of Is It Creativity that did well in this RC season so far. Again, we've got two more coming up soon, so they might change things, but creativity, despite Reed Duke taking it to his world's success, has not done great in any of its iterations since then. If you're looking at the Atraxa version, not great. Get rid of a threat, stop them from getting their Atraxa, game's over. Gearhulk creativity, there has been a little bit more buzz about, because getting these high value spells out of the graveyard and having a decent size artifact body that's just hard for decks to get rid of. It's pretty good, but not necessarily the winning formula right now. And the World Spine Worm variants haven't done that hot either. Now, the version that did well here was the Gearhulk version. Magma Opus, Sublime Epiphany to just continue looping these things. Stern Lesson to accelerate a potential Gearhulk. Same with Prismari Command, and it draws cards. This has a phenomenal backup plan that most of the other creativities don't necessarily possess. And then you look at the sideboard and you see a copy of Atraxa, Hullbreaker Horror. You've got the lesson package that this deck possesses. It's not surprising why this particular version is doing well compared to its other counterparts, but not necessarily the strongest this season. And we wind up at one of the more recent RCs in Japan and Korea. Now, unlike some of the others where we talked about this idea of balance, we get a better idea of where the Pioneer format is actually going currently. It is aggressive, hyper aggressive. Gruul vehicles, Convoke, Teamer vehicles, Grease Fang. While there is a combo here, it's still an aggressive deck. It is aggressively throwing its threats into the graveyard. Parhelion, the boat, the Seeker's Chariot, things that you really have to either interact with or you will die. And it just so happens to have a pretty good backup plan, especially with the Japanese versions that did well this past weekend. It's not surprising why we see the meta slanting in this direction. Now, again, making note of what we see here, lots of aggression. Lots of red X based aggression. Okay, the Teamer Vehicles list that did really well this weekend. We see typical vehicles things. The interesting changes, running one less Elvish Mystic, running the new battle invasion of Ixalan to look for some cards. only running one Lovestruck Beast, Migloz has actually proven its utility as a phenomenal spell for this deck. If you want to see some versions of red-green vehicles before the release of March of the Machines Aftermath and just March of the Machines, then check out some of our earlier videos on the channel. Voldaren Thrillseeker has been one of the greatest recent inclusions because you just get to turn any of your creatures or creatures that you steal with the Akroan War into massive threats, because the backup effect on Voldaren Thrillseeker, turning a Sky Sovereign into a 8/8 flying creature or planeswalker damaging threat, and then for 1 extra mana it can pop itself and deal 8 to face. Huge. There have been a lot of games that have gotten just blown out because of this coming down and changing the entire course of the game. Throwing in a Stubborn Denial to just protect everything is icing on the cake. It's beautiful. No notes. Still running the Gigantha package. There is a lot of debate amongst vehicles players about the merit of Gigantha versus having Embercleave and other double pip spells in the main. Lots of back and forth, but honestly, you can't go wrong with playing an 8th card in your hand that your opponent can't Thoughtseize, essentially. So, Gigantha version's probably doing real fine. Alright, and then the Greasefang iterations that we see doing well. Greasefang has popped up throughout this RC season, but it did the best in Japan. And it's clear when we look at this list why. Now, yes, it's still going really hard on the combo. You've still got Parhelion. You've still got Sky Sovereign. You've still got Chariot. You've still got these creatures to get it out of your hand, out of your library, and into the yard. However, it's doing 2 unique things in the main board to really up that aggression in game 1. Gurmag Angler, Shieldred. I haven't seen Gurmag Angler played in a competitive deck's main board since Grixis Death Shadow pre Modern Horizons 1. So seeing its triumphant return here and not in the Pauper format where it's an all-star there is big. The big fish being able to go through anything, block basically every creature that matters on the ground in Pioneer is huge. Combining that with Shieldred value, and it's unsurprising why this deck did well. Now, you should remember earlier in the video, I did talk about how there was some Rakdos innovation here. One Rakdos mid-range list made it into the top 8, a couple more across the top 16 and 32 that were running a main board Invoke Despair or 2, and moving up to control number lands, 26 lands. It makes sense why they might have been able to fight through some Greasefang decks, some mono green decks, despite it historically being kind of a bad matchup. But this deck is sweet. There is no denying that this is a phenomenal innovation. All right. And then we've got the Australian / New Zealand RC. Here we see basically what the format has become. Good, efficient aggro decks or slow decks that can adjust their board, rebuild, and win. Mono green continually showing up. Azorius Control continually showing up. Dimir Control actually had a pretty successful showing here, and check out any of our earlier videos on the channel where Mark plays through Dimir Control to get an idea of where this deck functions and does well, and why we haven't seen a lot of it before this point. Again, Thoughtseize is a great card, but when it's paired with good aggression, it makes sense why it can do well. Dimir Control doesn't have that same aggression, but it definitely controls a board, and it can recover from that. Here we see a lot of aggressive decks that actually did well. Boros Convoke did really fine. Is it Phoenix? Did really fine. Card advantage engines, woo. Here is probably the best weekend that we see for mono white humans this entire season. And the humans decks here, again, they are mono white, they are simple, they are low to the ground, they're doing their thing. The biggest recent innovations, again, Coppercoat Vanguard, obviously, Knight Errant of Eos, being able to just convoke your creatures, rebuild your hand, look at a couple of things off the top to maybe adjust the situation to adjust to a board, pretty big. Cutting down on a Brutal Cathar to run it makes a lot of sense. This card's dead in a lot of these control matchups. A lot of these counter spell decks aren't going to let it go through, especially if you're playing against Spirits, the tempo deck. Get this out for cheap, though. And then you get extra threats. And then this deck can do well. Now, I think it's important for us to remember that as we go through the rest of this season, that aggro, like mono white spirits, or rather mono white humans, Azorius spirits, are really good choices. Having a good aggressive game plan, and in the case of spirits, good counter spells to back up all of your threats and protect them, it's a winning formula. I'm saying it now. If you want to do well at your RCs, aggro and tempo are the way to go. But we hope to see all of you beautiful followers in Atlanta. I'm qualified. The rest of the teammates are making their way to qualifications, top eights across the board. But it's been great to analyze the Pioneer format with y'all. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. And see you next time. Peace.